Hello and welcome to Livewire Markets. My name is Chris Conway. Today I'm having a conversation with Olivia Wassenaar. Olivia is a partner and head of sustainability and infrastructure at global asset manager Apollo. She joins me ahead of the trip to Australia, where she's going to be talking to investors and a host of companies. Olivia, thanks so much for sitting down with Livewire.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Olivia, just to start, for those in our audience that aren't familiar with yourself or Apollo, can you just talk to us about your role and Apollo's sustainability and infrastructure platform?
Absolutely. So, Apollo is a global alternative asset manager and scaled private capital provider. We do credit, equity, capital solutions, and we've got a leading retirement and wealth platform. So, that's sort of Apollo as a whole. We're approaching about a trillion of AUM, which is a pretty incredible milestone. Um, in particular, so where I focus, I lead our infrastructure and sustainability funds and teams at Apollo. This has become an increasingly large part of who we are and what we do as a firm. We actually, I should have been keeping better track of this over time, but we recently tallied the numbers. We've put about 110 billion into infrastructure over the last 5 years, and about 80 billion into what I call sort of energy transition and other kind of clean investments. So it's been a really big part of who we are, what we do, and really where we see the opportunity set.
What's driving that new industrial age for infrastructure, Olivia? What's the behind the big global push to rebuild power and infrastructure systems like you were just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, things are changing, right? I mean, we are rethinking and rebuilding systems that came together over centuries, and we're having to do it over a matter of decades. So whether you think about transportation, electricity demand, as you think about how we use power, industrial demand, the world's changing, and we're having to adapt to it. We think about infrastructure. We always say, if you kick it, it hurts. That's really how we think about infrastructure as a firm. But yeah, I mean, the world's changing. Global electricity consumption is rising. We are thinking about different types of fossil fuels and how we think about sort of the longevity of those. Obviously, AI has really been the topic du jour, particularly over the last year, but really over the last several years. Thinking about where energy is needed versus where energy is produced. All of these, when you put them together, really create a tremendous global need for building out new electricity sources, new data sources. In some cases, new roads, new industrial centers. It's really changing so much of how we think about the global economy.
Olivia, just to zoom in a little bit there, you were talking about where energy is created and then where it's stored, and even I think it was in Davos, President Trump was talking about the fact that the US, like Australia, has an old grid system and maybe won't have the necessary technical capacity to move energy around. How important is all of that to make sure that wind and solar is reliable and available when it's needed and where it's needed, like you were just talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, similar to Australia, one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with in the US right now is an aging grid. Depending on how you look at it, these are, we're probably decades past where we needed to be on grid updates. When you think about the pipeline, when you think about how much needs to get built, it's really humbling. So it certainly is a big concern of all of ours. And again, part of it is aging grid, part of it is just shifting where we actually need power, and I know that's a large issue in Australia as well. So certainly really central to how we think about things here.
Olivia, let's talk about how Apollo plugs into this opportunity and the way that the group finances these projects. They're capital intensive, they're long term. I watched the CNBC interview of yours. You're talking about 20, 30-year timeframes for these assets. So, yeah, how does Apollo think about it and, like I said, plug into that opportunity that's available?
Yeah, I mean it's massive, right? Like the AI related power opportunity is about 4.5 trillion this decade alone. It's a number so far above where we've seen capital deployed in other areas. So it's certainly, something we are very focused on. I know the markets are very focused on. It's a real concern. You're seeing discussions around hyperscalers where, markets are saying, hey, this is, bring your own power, right? You've got to, you can't count on existing power sources. Like you've really got to show up with power as well. Just given, given what it's doing to prices and otherwise. In the U.S. right now, you're seeing really some measures around, pricing in certain markets and rethinking, what we're doing there. One of the biggest questions I get asked, right, is AI bubble, right? Is this something that is here now, and in a few years we're going to look back and say, my gosh, I can't believe we were so fussed about AI. I don't think we know yet. It doesn't feel like a bubble. But regardless, one of the reasons we're really leaning into investing in power infrastructure, is the fact that, regardless of whether or not AI shows up to the degree or hyperscalers show up to the degree that we thought they would, you're still going to, there's so many different uses of power and industrial demand and otherwise. Which is why for us, it's really such a large opportunity. We recently closed on the acquisition of a large hydro portfolio in the U.S. For us, super interesting. This is base load green power, and it's fascinating, right? Some of these facilities are 100 years old, right? I mean, we look at adding power demand in the U.S., but I think there's also a big play around how do we improve some of the existing power generation resources we have today. We've long had a thesis around hydro, and the fact that there's some pretty easy upgrades that can be made there to really, increase generation in key markets.
Olivia, just to follow up there, if I may, does the risk profile of these assets and this opportunity, is that one of the most appealing features? Because like you were just saying, even if the energy that is being created and that Apollo is investing in isn't being used by the AI revolution, there's always going to be demand for that energy somewhere. It's almost you can't lose, right?
Exactly. With thinking about, sort of, whether it's, increased electrification, right? So whether it's cars, it's home, there's a real sort of thesis around this sort of electrification of everything. We've certainly seen a massive push of that globally, over the last decade. And that's been part of what has taken what for many years was a pretty flat power market in most geographies, has really meant that all of a sudden we're having this power demand growth for the first time really in 20 years. And that's really around this sort of broader electrification theme. So yes, AI is a huge portion of it. And certainly is going to be a big demand driver. But this broader electrification theme, homes, cars, etc., is really driving that need as well. So going back to sort of where we're investing, we are really focused on just really whether it's repowering or building new power resources. That's been a really big focus of ours at Apollo.
You talked about the hydro, Olivia. Is there another project that you could just share with the audience to give an idea of the type of projects that Apollo has been investing in? And then again, in another interview, I heard you talking about the different stages. So whether it's, right at the point of energy production or whether it's building the infrastructure to generate the energy, how do you make those sorts of decisions about what gets into the portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing besides hydro that we've been very bullish on is battery storage. I've been a big proponent of battery storage for many years. One, it smooths intermittency, right? So we've invested in large portfolios of battery storage. The most recent, we bought a large package from Total. We're partners with them in the US on the solar and battery side now. And part of that was really a thesis around intermittency, that you've got all these new sources of renewable power that, solar is very effective when the sun shines and wind's really effective when the wind blows. And sometimes that's not happening. So having batteries be able to really smooth that out, and really, really limit that intermittency is so key. The other thing I love about batteries is they're modular, right? And so when you're thinking about adding, sort of broader power resources, a lot of these plants are massive, right? If you're, the decision to build and finance a CCGT is really different from solar and batteries, which, as long as you have the land and the interconnect, can be done in a really modular way. So that's one of the things we've really liked about that. I think you're going to continue to see more around batteries in terms of really, smoothing different grid systems globally.
Olivia, let's shift focus just slightly to Australia. Selfishly, want to talk to the Australian opportunity. Apollo's been or had a presence here in Australia since 2018. So, how important is Australia to the strategy? And then, are there some unique opportunities that you see within the Australian market?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, we've been in Australia since 2018. It is a real growing area of focus for us. We love the market. We think it's really interesting. I would say from an energy and infrastructure perspective, it's certainly a really interesting market for us, and frankly, dealing with a lot of the same, constraints that the U.S. is, right? So whether that is, energy demand in different places from where you have energy supply, needs to build out the grid. Obviously, with the big development in renewable power, this intermittency issue around, how do we smooth that? There's a big portion of Australian power supply that still comes from coal. I also love that Australians love infrastructure. So whether it's roads, ports, airports, power, I feel very at home in discussions in Australia around infrastructure because obviously it's what I do, and so when I come to a market where it's such a big part of where investment has taken place historically, it's a fun dialogue.
Yeah, you're right, Olivia. We do love infrastructure, and I think it harks back to the history of mining here in Australia. Big projects, long-term projects, projects that have sustainable cash flows, and Australian investors love their steady income. We're a high dividend-paying equity market, so. Just pivoting back to what you're doing and what's Apollo doing, how are the projects that you're focused on, how can they provide that reliable income that investors, here in Australia particularly seek?
These tend to be long dated assets, assets with, to your point, a yield or a dividend coming off them over time. And that's a big thing that we've been focused on, especially with our insurance balance sheets. Over the last several years is really those sort of long duration assets, right? How do we think about, financing, some of these, assets that are long dated assets? You're thinking about financing them differently than you would, if you buy a company and you underwrite that, and you're probably looking at a shorter tenor. As we think about infrastructure assets, you can certainly you're looking at a much longer time horizon. Again, energy, natural resources, broader infrastructure, power, roads, like these are all big things that lend itself really nicely to that longer dated capital, which is really what we have in the insurance balance sheet.
Olivia, last question before I let you go. I imagine you're exposed to some really exciting projects, technology, innovation, amazing things that people are doing in this space. Is there anything that's really captured your attention recently that you've seen where you've been blown away, if you will, by what's going on?
Oh gosh, I don't know if blown away. A couple things come to mind. Nuclear was something that for many decades we kind of stopped talking about.
Yep.
So in my portfolio, we've owned a nuclear services business for a few years, and it's been it was kind of a nice steady for a few years, and in the last couple of years, it's really taken off as you've seen a resurgence in that market.
Is that sorry, Olivia? Is that because of the small modular reactor technology that's coming online?
Twofold. It is the small modular reactor technology for sure, the
Yep.
SMRs, and that's something that's very much on the come. I think there's a lot of discussion about it. We're super excited about it. It's still several years away. You are seeing restarts and repowerings of existing nuclear plants. plants that were shut down or scheduled to be shut down, where you're really extending the life cycle of those facilities. But I think for the first time in a while, you're hearing discussions really of new nuclear facilities. It's been a while since, for example, we've seen that in the U.S. markets, but many other markets globally, it has been very topical, and I think you have seen a real progression in sort of technology and construction timelines. So that's something that we've had a positive view on for years, and it's really nice to see sort of an embracing of that as a market, just as we think about baseload clean power, and sources for that. The other thing I think a lot about is, I mentioned batteries before. I think the big holdback on batteries has been duration. So today, most of the basic utility scale batteries you use are going to be 4 hours, which is kind of not enough. So they're helpful, but I do really think sort of the next wave is how can we really get long duration batteries? How can we get 12-hour, 24-hour batteries, et cetera, that are really going to sort of change the game around battery storage? I think you see some interesting technologies developing globally here. We're watching a lot of them in our battery businesses that we own today. We own both, we own actually the battery assets in our power businesses. We also own a battery services business, which services and installs batteries. So it's a part of the market we've been following really closely. I think, to me, if we can sort of crack the code on economic, scalable, long duration batteries, that's going to be a really big change in the equation around power markets.
Olivia, I could talk to you about this stuff all day. It is very exciting, but I see it's dark outside your windows there in New York. So we'll let you go, but thank you so much for talking through your world and the opportunities that you're seeing. And I hope that you have a pleasant trip to Australia. I understand you're coming down in the next week or so.
I am. Chris, thank you so much for the time. Thanks for the good discussion and questions. This has been a lot of fun, and absolutely, I always look forward to my trips to Australia. I'll be there in a week or so, and very much looking forward to that as well.
If you enjoyed that interview, make sure to give it a like, and don't forget to follow our YouTube channel. We're adding lots of great content every single week.